Hi, I'm Rob.
And I'm Rob.
And this is Ask Rob and Rob.
Hello everyone and welcome to Ask Rob and Rob, the show where you give us great questions and we, in return, try to give you great answers. This week we've got a cracking question coming up. But before we dig into that, let us tell you how you can get your great question on the show.
Yes, all you've got to do is give us a call on 013 808 00035. That's 013 808 00035. Or you can do it via your computer by going to thepropertyhub.net/ask. When you do that, all you've got to do is read out your question and leave us your name. Because if you don't leave us your name, we'll make up one for you. So this week's question comes in from Jeffery.
Hi Rob and Rob, thank you for all the work you do on the podcast. It's absolutely invaluable. Just had a quick question, just in case I missed anything on this week's podcast. Rob actually outlined one of the mistakes that he made that cost him, I think, £16,500. It was the potential Manchester flat he could have bought over the house that he purchased in Hull. Now, when he purchased the house in Hull, he mentioned that he was actually able to do that after the renovation work with £8,500 left in. And because of the change in capital growth that's happened in Manchester, if he had purchased that property, the flat, he would have actually got £16,500 worth of capital growth that he didn't realise being in Hull. Now, one thing that the Robs failed to take into account in this case was what if the extra funds that would have been needed to buy the Manchester flat that was 3 times more expensive, the extra money that would have had to have been left in, if that was redeployed in a less expensive property that still achieved capital growth, could that have negated the losses on the Manchester property, as well as realising better cash flow across both the Hull and other property? Hopefully that makes sense. Be keen to hear your opinions on that, and if that's worth taking into account when assessing deals in the future. Thanks again for the work you do. Both of you fantastic. Keep up the good work.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Really great question. I had a few emails about this one as well, so I'm really glad you asked and gave us a chance to actually do a whole episode around this. So this is based on an episode that we did back in December called Rob D's £16,800 mistake. If you haven't listened to that episode, I strongly encourage you to do it because actually I think it's one of the most important episodes that we did last year. I'll quickly recap the gist of that episode if you hadn't heard it. So I was talking about a few years ago when I bought a cheap property in Hull that ended up making me a rental profit of £2,400 per year, but had very limited capital growth prospects. And I managed to achieve a really great ROI on that, which is 27%, by refurbishing the property and pulling some of my money back out. I contrasted that with like an alternative universe where instead of doing that, if I'd bought a more expensive property in Manchester, I still would have made a profit of £2,400 per year, but I also would have already made £16,800 in capital growth by now. And that's where the title of the episode came from. Now, a few people rightly emailed in to point out that total return is a combination of both income and growth. And my total return of 27% on the cheap property is still higher than the income plus the growth of the more expensive property. So if I'd just bought 3 of the cheap ones, which for roughly the same amount of money I could have done, I'd actually be better off by now and not worse off. Now, if you put aside the fact that capital growth gains compound over the long term, this is absolutely correct. But the point of that episode was to emphasise that you need to choose the right strategy for your circumstances. And there's an element of my circumstances that maybe I didn't emphasise enough. At that particular point, my constraint wasn't cash, but time. So even being hands-off and getting other people to do a lot of the work, I couldn't have bought 3 cheaper properties in a year and refurbished them. It wasn't something that I could have done, but chose not to do. I physically couldn't do that with everything else that I had going on in other areas of my life. The reasons for that are obvious. Finding suitable properties and getting them at the right price is really time consuming, as is actually doing the refurb, even if you're not physically in there doing the plastering yourself. So I could only do one of those properties, and that left the rest of my cash that I had available sitting in the bank doing not very much. In my alternative universe, by spending actually less time, I could have bought that one growth-oriented property in Manchester, used up all my cash, and be sitting on a capital gain of £16,800 already. So yes, it is an attention-grabbing number and it doesn't tell the full story, but in my specific situation, it was absolutely true. And just to make me feel even worse about it, it is getting worse with every passing year. But the key point in there is that this was my situation. And more than that, it was my situation at that point in time. So in the past, minimising the cash that I had left in a deal was the right approach for me. And now it's not, and I'm sure that my priorities will change again in the future. But you should never listen to anyone who tells you that one way of doing things is better than another, because it's impossible to make that statement without understanding your situation. Am I saying that you shouldn't buy cheap properties? No. Am I saying that you shouldn't do refurbs? No. Am I saying that you shouldn't care about ROI? Not at all. What I'm saying is that you should always think deeply about your goals and your strategy. And that's what we wanted you to come away from this episode with.
Rob D, you're bringing fire to Ask Rob and Rob this week. That was a great answer. To add to that great question and great answer, I would say you have to take into account your time cost, which I think a lot of people who've contacted Rob have failed to appreciate, because your time cost of doing those refurbs isn't factored into that return. So how much time and effort, not just finding the properties, but actually managing, or if you're doing it yourself, doing the refurbs, how much of that are you getting from your return? Would you have been better off just buying a place that was ready to go? There are so many variables, but that's why Rob said that you really need to understand who you are, what you want from this, and also your current circumstances as well. You may want to do cheap refurbs hundreds of miles away from home because the ROI is quite attractive. But if you're time poor, you work long hours, then that's going to be a difficult strategy to implement. And you may be best considering other options more suitable to where you are right now.
I think it's also worth noting that we often see people picking the wrong strategy for them in the opposite direction as well. So we'll hear from people who say, I've got £30,000, so I'm going to use that to buy a buy-to-let property. Don't have much time, so I need to buy something that's just ready to go, ready for tenants to move in. And in 5 years' time, I want to have 10 properties and be able to retire. And in that situation, it's like, well, okay, that's your goal. That's great. But how are you going to achieve that if you've got all your money tied up in the property? You'd need to be very lucky and get some really good capital gains in order to pull your money out and recycle your cash. And even if you could, it's not going to happen in that time frame. So if that's the situation, then you have to be doing the refurbs. You have to be recycling the cash. That's the only way that you're going to achieve that goal. So again, there is no simple answer. It's going to be different for everybody. And the only way to get to the right answer is to be, first of all, very clear about what your goals are, and also to be honest with yourself about what your constraints are as well. When you combine those two things, then lots of options will rule themselves out. And that's a good thing, because often it's overwhelming to come into property and look at all these things that you could do. But in reality, the choice isn't as wide as it seems. You can filter it down based on what it is that you're trying to do and the situation you're in. You'll be left with just a few options, and then you can choose from those.
So Jeffrey, a fantastic question. And we'd really encourage you to question the podcast on any episode. Not just you, Jeffrey, but anyone who's listening right now. If you've listened to a podcast in the past and you thought, that's great, but I see it this way, or that's great, but I'd like to understand that further, use Ask Rob and Rob as a tool of doing that. Get in touch, ask your question, comment on what we've said, debate what we've said, and we're more than happy to answer it. Because Jeffrey wasn't wrong, and we weren't disappointed or angry that he's put that question in. It's a fantastic question because it actually allowed us to drop even more education points on top of what was already a pretty decent podcast. So Jeffrey, thank you so much for allowing us to do that. Please, if you're listening to this now and you've had a question about a previous podcast that you'd like further clarification on, then please do get in touch. And of course, you can do that from your computer or mobile phone by going to thepropertyhub.net/ask or call in on 013 808 00035. We'll be back next week with another Ask Rob and Rob, and we'll be back for the main event, the Property Podcast, on Thursday. But until then, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.